Wouldn't it be like the most petty, humiliating, yet startling thing if I just fired my hat at him?
He built a film around a man's life story, poured years of care into it, and then watched that same man become someone he no longer recognized. This is the story of how Ron Howard, one of Hollywood's most even-tempered and respected figures, found himself utterly disillusioned by a person he once tried to understand with compassion. It is not a story of screaming matches or public feuds. It is quieter than that, and in some ways far more painful, because it involves trust, artistic integrity, and the slow, uncomfortable realization that someone you believed in has become almost unrecognizable. For over 6 decades, Ron Howard has occupied a strange and enviable position in American entertainment. He rose to fame as a child actor, became one of the most bankable directors in Hollywood, and somehow managed to avoid nearly every scandal, feud, and controversy that swallows up so many of his peers. Colleagues describe him as disciplined, thoughtful, and almost unfailingly kind. Producers who have worked with him for decades say he rarely raises his voice, rarely complains, and almost never speaks ill of anyone publicly. That reputation was built slowly, film by film, decade by decade, starting from the moment a 6-year-old boy from Duncan, Oklahoma stepped onto a television set and became Opie Taylor. But even a man defined by patience and restraint has his breaking points, and one of the clearest examples in recent years centers on JD Vance, the author whose memoir Howard adapted into a major motion picture. In 2016, JD Vance published Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir chronicling his upbringing in a struggling Rust Belt family, his complicated relationship with addiction within his household, and his eventual path to Yale Law School and a career far removed from his origins. The book became a sensation, in part because it arrived during a moment when much of America was trying to understand the frustrations and anxieties of working-class communities in Appalachia and the Midwest. Reviewers and readers alike saw it as an intimate, unpolished portrait of resilience. Ron Howard was drawn to that story. By the time he signed on to direct the film adaptation, released by Netflix in 2020, he was already one of the most accomplished directors in the industry, having won an Academy Award for A Beautiful Mind, and helmed acclaimed films like Apollo 13 and Frost/Nixon. Howard has spoken in interviews about what attracted him to Vance's story. It was not politics, he insisted, but the raw human material underneath it. He wanted to explore how someone survives a chaotic, painful childhood and still manages to build a different life. The film starred Amy Adams and Glenn Close, both of whom received awards attention for their performances, even as critics were more divided on the film itself. During production, Howard and Vance reportedly had limited direct political conversation. At that point in his life, Vance was a venture capitalist and author, not yet a public political figure. He had not run for office, had not aligned himself firmly with any political movement, and had, in fact, been known for critical remarks about Donald Trump in his earlier public commentary. For Howard, this made the collaboration feel safe and straightforward. He was adapting a personal memoir, not endorsing a political career that did not yet exist. That changed dramatically in the years that followed. Vance entered politics, won a U.S. Senate seat from Ohio in 2022, and became one of the most visible and vocal figures in a new wave of conservative populism. His rhetoric shifted sharply, embracing positions and language that stood in stark contrast to the reflective, searching tone of the memoir Howard had adapted. By 2024, Vance had been selected as a vice presidential running mate, placing him squarely in the national spotlight and intensifying scrutiny of his earlier writing, his political evolution, and his associations. For Howard, watching this transformation was reportedly disorienting. In interviews given after Vance's rise to national prominence, Howard has been notably careful with his words, but the underlying sentiment has been unmistakable. He has spoken about how people can change, sometimes so dramatically that they become almost unrecognizable from who they once were. He did not resort to personal attacks, and he did not publicly denounce Vance in dramatic terms. That has never been Howard's style. Instead, he chose the same tool he has always relied upon: careful, measured language, chosen the way a filmmaker chooses which scene to include and which to leave out. What made this particular disappointment sting, according to people familiar with Howard's thinking, was the personal investment involved. Directing a film based on someone's real life requires a kind of intimacy. Howard had to imagine Vance as a frightened child watching addiction tear through his family. He had to find the humanity in a story that could easily have become exploitative or sensationalized. He worked to portray Vance and his family with dignity, even as he faced criticism from some corners for softening or simplifying aspects of that very story. To have poured that level of care into telling someone's story, only to watch that person publicly embrace rhetoric Howard found troubling, created a particular kind of disillusionment. It was not simply political disagreement. It was the feeling that he had, in some sense, helped elevate a public image that the man's later actions seemed to contradict. Howard has never claimed to be a political commentator, and he has resisted the urge to become one, even as pressure mounts on public figures to weigh in on every major controversy. What he has done instead is something more subtle. He has urged people, in general terms, to pay close attention to what politicians say and do, to listen carefully, and to remember that character reveals itself over time. Those who have followed his public statements closely note that he tends to speak less about individuals and more about principles, honesty, consistency, the gap between the story someone tells about themselves and the way they behave once given power. Interestingly, this was not the first time in Howard's life that he experienced this particular kind of quiet disappointment, the sense of being let down by someone whose public image did not match private reality. Long before Vance, there was Francis Bavier, the actress who played Aunt Bee on the Andy Griffith Show, the very series that first made Howard a household name as young Opie Taylor. On screen, Aunt Bee radiated warmth. She was the emotional center of the Taylor household, a woman whose home-cooked meals and gentle wisdom made Mayberry feel like a real, loving family. Off-screen, according to Howard's own later recollections, the relationship was far more distant. Bavier was a serious, private woman who did not enjoy the loose, jokes and pranks atmosphere that Andy Griffith cultivated on set. Howard has said in various interviews over the years that she never showed him the kind of warmth her character displayed, that she treated him professionally but coldly, more like a colleague than a child who might have appreciated some encouragement. One memory in particular has stayed with him. During the filming of an episode built around Aunt Bee's terrible homemade pickles, young Ron Howard, who genuinely disliked pickles, had to eat them repeatedly across multiple takes, all while Bavier stood across from him with what he later described as an unsmiling, businesslike demeanor. It was a small moment in the scope of a long career, but it lodged itself in his memory as an early lesson about the difference between performed warmth and the real thing. He has said that experience, along with others like it, taught him early on how to distinguish authentic kindness from a performance, a skill that would serve him well decades later as he tried to make sense of very different kinds of disappointment. What connects these two experiences, separated by more than 50 years, is not scandal or bitterness in any dramatic sense. Howard has never launched public campaigns against either Bavier or Vance. He has not used interviews to settle scores. Instead, both stories reveal something quieter and in some ways more human, the particular ache of realizing that someone's public persona and private reality do not align, and the discipline it takes to respond to that realization with restraint rather than anger. Howard's approach throughout his career has been to let his work speak for him. When faced with backlash over the Da Vinci Code in 2006, he defended the film's right to exist as fiction without attacking the religious groups who criticized it. When A Beautiful Mind drew criticism for omitting difficult details of John Nash's life, Howard acknowledged the choices he made without becoming defensive or dismissive of the critics. That same steadiness has defined how he has handled his complicated feelings about Vance, choosing thoughtfulness over outrage, principle over personal attack. There is something quietly powerful in that restraint. In an entertainment industry that often rewards outrage, dramatic statements, and viral confrontations, Howard has built an entire career, and an entire reputation, on doing the opposite. He tells stories about human beings, flawed and complicated as they are, and he extends that same complexity to the people who have disappointed him. He does not pretend Francis Bavier was warm when she was not. He does not pretend Vance is still the humble, searching young man from the pages of his memoir. But he also does not allow disappointment to curdle into public bitterness. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson embedded in both stories. Ron Howard learned, first as a child actor standing across from a distant Aunt Bee, and later as an accomplished director watching a subject's public transformation, that people are rarely as simple as the roles they play or the images they project. Some people show you exactly who they are, whether through quiet coldness or through loud rhetoric, and the wisest response is not fury, but attention. Howard has spent a lifetime paying that kind of attention, translating it into stories that resonate precisely because they refuse to flatten people into heroes or villains. In the end, his disappointment in those who let him down says less about bitterness and more about how deeply he believes in the difference between performance and truth, a belief that has quietly shaped both his art and his life.